Is it ready? All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacque Thurman. Looking forward to meeting all of you and working with you and getting to know you better. I'm the clinical director at Hope and Home, and I've been here since about 2002. Started out as a home supervisor and have pretty much done everything with licensing and group homes, education. So I've been here a long time, and I basically oversee the licensing process. So if there are any nicks or snags in your licensing process, it usually will come to me, and we'll figure out how we can work through things. So have any of you been to a launch yet? No, but you...
Two.
Okay, but you guys have had Julie's class, Attachment and Loss?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so this is pretty much part 2 of that class. And I don't know if some of you probably may have met Ross on your tours, but Ross is our executive director.
And I also filled in on one of your classes.
Oh, you did?
So I met a number of you guys doing that.
Yeah.
Is there anybody here that has never been in a class?
There shouldn't be.
I know there shouldn't be, but I want to make sure. Every once in a while, someone raises their hand and says, "This is my first class." It's like, oops, well, we got to fix that. Yeah, this should not be your first class.
Yeah. So we're going to be co-teaching tonight, and the handout that you started with, I know the article is very long, and if you notice on the quiz, I did put the page numbers where the answers can be found in that article, because it's very long, but it's extremely rich in information and very sound recommendations regarding reactive attachment disorder. Some people have never heard of it. It's a term that you'll hear tossed around a lot in foster care, and we want our families to be really well informed and to really have an edge in their knowledge regarding this, because a lot of therapists, well-intended but maybe not experienced, will slap that diagnosis on kids flippantly. And what you'll see as you read through the article and complete the quiz is there's a tremendous stigma that comes with that diagnosis. So I'm going to let you guys finish that, on your own time, but I understand if you don't have time to read every line of that heavy insert, but just know that I tried to make it a little bit easier by putting the page numbers where the answers can be found. So it's not quite as time-consuming. So the topic tonight, it's basically part 2 of attachment and loss, and we're really going to focus on the grief and loss aspect. Children in foster care experience very real grief, and I know when we think of grief, we often think of it in the context of grieving the death of a loved one, but there's so many things in life that are worthy of being grieved for. People losing jobs, moving away from family, changing schools, maybe even retiring. All kinds of life situations can warrant grief, and grief is basically acknowledging the loss of something that you were attached to, something that you had an emotional connection to, something that made you feel significant. Maybe it can also be experienced in the context of losing a parent who is maybe abusive, or cutting ties with maybe an ex-spouse or a spouse who was toxic. So grief isn't limited to grieving good things. Grief can be experienced, even whenever we lose something that was unpleasant as well. So that's important to keep in mind when you're working with kids in foster care, because it's easy for us to think, why would they be so sad about losing their parents? I mean, their parents were high on meth all the time and they were never home. Like, how could they be upset, that they're not in that situation anymore? And so it's important to realize, even if it wasn't pleasant, or even if it was harmful, that might be all that they ever knew. There's an example of a study that researchers did. They observed mice in an electric shock box, and they would just deliver these low-grade electrical shocks intermittently. And over time, it was definitely painful and unpleasant, but over time, they got used to it. So whenever the researchers let them out and they let them into a playland, with mazes and toys and little running wheels, they found that the mice, whenever they encountered something unfamiliar, they ran back to the shock box because that was comfortable. That was what they knew. And we see the same dynamic with children coming into foster care. They're coming from a place that was not healthy, that was not safe, was very uncomfortable, that was even harmful and hurtful. And they're coming into Hope and Home with the Zoom Dougal Factory and the Teddy Bear Clinic and, the Summers Oh Fun and everything we have to offer here. They're coming into families who are super eager to give these kids everything that they've missed out on. But it's also important to remember, in the context of grief and loss, that sometimes kids in foster care, their behaviors will demonstrate and illustrate that sometimes familiar pain can be more comfortable than unfamiliar pleasure. So you'll see that dynamic play out. Sometimes when kids come into care, maybe you are really excited, you're taking the whole family to Elitch's, and this is their first time ever to go to an amusement park. And most kids will love it. They'll do fine. But there are some kids who will just sabotage the whole day because they're more comfortable with tension and chaos than they are with everybody having a good time. So it's a dynamic, and it doesn't happen across the board, all the time. But when something like that does happen, just come back to this class and remember, familiar pain can be more comfortable than unfamiliar pleasure. Their brains can be rewired to be able to connect and enjoy experiences. But the losses they experience, even if they were, terrible places, even if they came from terrible places, they can still experience profound grief and a sense of loss over those things. Let's draw on...
Before you do that, let me... any of you have the opportunity a couple of years ago to see a movie called Room? No? It was kind of
it was a book as well.
It was a book called Room, and it became a movie, and I think it won an Academy Award.
Room, you're saying?
Room.
Oh, I thought you said Groom at first.
No, Room.
Oh, I've seen Room.
Yeah.
Isn't it like the woman is like trapped and then she ends up having a child? Mm-hmm. She's taking man. Yeah.
So here's a woman who was, as a high school student, or maybe just out of high school, she was like 17, 18 years old. She's kidnapped by this horrible person that locks her up in a container or a shed and won't ever let her out. And so he brings food in and drinks in, and food and water, and eventually, and of course has sex with her, rapes her, and she ends up having a child. And so the movie starts. It's a great movie. It's kind of one of these movies where when the movie's over with, the whole audience just kind of sits there, kind of like, whoa, this was very heavy, and so the movie starts when the kid is like 5 years old, I think, and
it's shared really from his perspective, and that's what was so kind of groundbreaking about the book, is that the author was actually able to use kind of a 5-year-old's voice to tell the story.
And the child,
really
and the child in the movie, of course, is born into this environment, and mom wants him to be as normal as possible, so she homeschools him in this environment. She teaches him and talks to him, and they do. You watch them doing gym, they do exercises and those sort of things. But eventually, they get out. And it's a big publicity. I mean, it's a big thing for the news and everyone. They find the bad guy, and now the story is she goes home. And what's it like for her to go back to her family? And this child in the beginning can't even open his eyes because he's never been outside, and so they have to have blinders or sunglasses on his eyes. And you expect that now, that's the bad part. Now the best part, all the good stuff. Well, it's not all that great. He really struggles to integrate back into the world because he's only had this one person in his whole life. And in a moment of great frustration, he says, "I miss room." Because he called it room, and he missed room, and it's kind of a mind blower to the audience watching it, because he was a captive in a shed. And it was horrible. It's horrific. And a one very small little shed. And it was awful. But he says, "I miss room." And that's kind of the turning point in the whole movie, when the audience starts to realize exactly what Jacque is saying, is that from his perspective, it was his life. It was where he grew up. It's where he and his mom were always together. And now mom leaves. And now, this whole world is so different. And I think about, as I was watching this movie, my head immediately went to what it's like to be a child going into foster care. You're coming out of a terrible place. You wouldn't be removed if it wasn't a terrible place. Let's keep that in mind. A very less than 1% of 1% of kids in child welfare are removed. And so it has to be really significant to be taken away from your family. And so even though it could be the worst family in the world, the worst setup, like room, the kids oddly still are attached. And when you're attached to even something bad, and that attachment is severed, especially quickly, there's grief and loss that go with it.
Yeah. Was anybody in here, or do you know anybody who was displaced by either one of the fires, Waldo Canyon or Black Forest Fire? Yeah? Oh, yeah? Mm-hmm. Which fire was it?
The Waldo Canyon.
What can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it was coming over the bridge, and it was like, you have 4 hours to pack up whatever you need to take and leave. And so we just quickly ran around the house and grabbed big books and passports and computers and left. And I think we were out of the house for probably, I don't know, maybe it was 4 or 5 days.
Yeah. Where did you go?
To Littleton. We had family up in Littleton area.
Yeah.
Just stayed with them. Mm-hmm. They had 2 little boys that they were young at the time.
Yeah.
You were smarter than we were, because we have a flat roof. So this building, and so we went up there to watch the eclipse. But
it wasn't
recently, we went up there to watch the eclipse. But before that, we heard the fire was coming around the mountain here, so we all went up there and watched it. And we realized we were up there way too long watching the fire, like, oh boy, it's about here. So when most of the Hope and Home staff came out and got in their cars, I was one of them, the police thought this was already evacuated. I'm not giving you great confidence in us. but so as we were pulling our cars out of the parking lot, this area was already shut down, and the police were like, what are you doing? And so they just pointed us in the direction of Rock Rimmon, which then got us over to Woodman, which was one way heading out of town. And I found out on television that my home was one of the homes I couldn't get to, so I didn't even get a chance to go get any clothes. And about 4 of us, I have some very cool pictures. I have video of our parking lot, what our by the time all of us got to the parking lot, the sun was blotted out by the dark, by the smoke, and it was just howling here. And we all felt pretty stupid. We waited on the roof way too long. But it was, to answer your question, very disorienting to spend 5 days unprepared, away from home.
Yeah. So when did you get the notice? What was that like whenever you got...
I just remember that somebody at one point said we had 4 hours or so based on the fire to get out.
Yeah.
So about 4 hours.
Yeah. We had an employee here as well for the Black Forest fire. And we were up in my office and... saw the news, like, wow, there's a fire in Black Forest. Had no idea the scale it would turn out to be. And so she started driving home to check on things, and her street was blocked off. They would not let her get to her home, but her stepdad was home, and he was planted there. He was not going anywhere. And I remember her talking about just... the helplessness and the panic of not being able to go back there just to even get basic necessities. And her stepdad ended up evacuating, at the last minute. And he just grabbed like a laundry basket of just really random stuff, because he was so disoriented and in shock he couldn't think. And Jess, went on to, just share with us throughout the next year. And her home did go up in flames, burned to the ground. It was the only home, I think, in Cathedral Pines that actually burned. But throughout the next year, she would share with us moments whenever she would just like wake up with a jolt in the middle of the night, and she would remember something, from her childhood. That she would never get to see again or never get back. She would remember a certificate or a report card or, an outfit, from her prom or something. And so many times over that year, she would just wake up with a jolt, like, I'm never going to, see that again. And... there's been so many people who have shared their stories of being displaced, in that fire, and just how challenging it was, even for adults, who have coping skills and who intellectually know what's going on and who can rationalize and convince ourselves that maybe it's not going to hit our home, everything's going to be okay, and it can be challenging, even for adults who have coping skills. So just think about, that experience, that word picture of being displaced, by the Waldo Canyon fire or Black Forest fire. And imagine how disorienting and shocking and overwhelming that feels. And then, multiply that by, 11 or 12. The last time I taught this class, it was very small, so I don't have enough copies. But if anyone... Oh, you have it. Awesome. Okay, good. I'm going to give you one to look on too if you want. But what we're going to look at is, an actual placement history of one of our children. And it starts on page 2. So turn over to page 2 at the very bottom. And let's just walk through, this child's journey through foster care and how many times he was displaced. The first was in 2007.
Now, before you do that, Jacque, I'm looking at the first page, and it says his birthday was 2002. Right?
Yeah, so he's 5.
He's 5.
And really, he's like 1 or 2 weeks shy of being 5. He comes into care 1 or 2 weeks before his 5th birthday. So that just compounds the sting of it. So he came in March and landed somewhere. He was there for about 2 weeks. And so many times, in foster care, kids come to us in the middle of the night on an emergency basis. I don't remember the details of why he came into care or when, but Hope and Home and the caseworker, at 2:30 in the morning, not everybody answers their phone. Our options are often limited at 2:30 in the morning, and so it's often just trying to find a place for a child to land, just so they're not at the police station or at DHS all night. And so kids sometimes land in a foster home that way. Sometimes it can be a great fit, and sometimes it can be just a spot to buy us time and buy DHS time to find, somewhere more permanent. So he was here for 2 weeks, and then he moved to another home on March 31st. He was there for 2 months. Yeah, he was there for 2 months. Then he moved in May of 2007 again, and he was there for about 5 months. Okay, and respite, those are, there's still changes. Did you guys go over respite and everything in Volume 7 at all? Yeah, so, respite is a lifesaver for foster families because foster families need breaks, and respite, a lot of families are uncomfortable sending kids to respite, but it can often increase the permanency for kids in a home just by giving parents a break. So it looks like he was placed in respite 2 different times when he was in that home. And then he moved again in October.
It says he's not an adoptive option.
And he was there for 1.5 months. So look at this. I mean, just on page 2, he comes into care in March, and he's been in 4 homes by November. Not counting respite. Okay? Let's flip over to page 1 and go down to the bottom. This home, he was his longest stretch. He was with this home for over almost a year and a half or so. And this home was a single lady in her 50s, and she was initially an adoptive option, and that's why he went there. But some things changed. His mom's parental rights were terminated. And she had just gotten into a new relationship, and she ultimately decided that she felt like she was not in a stage in her life where she could give him what he needed. So it was heartbreaking because that everybody was thinking she's his mom. They're gonna end up, being a forever family. And so imagine, this child, as young as he is, finally being somewhere for a year plus, thinking he's going to be adopted, and then having to move again. So then he went through some respite, and then he moved again in January of 2009, and he was there for 4 months. And this was his brother's foster mom. So he and his brother had been separated like right after they came into care. And his brother had experienced a similar situation where he was with an adoptive home for over a year. But then, life happens. The foster family ended up having some really serious health issues, and they felt like all of their energy needed to go into that. So they felt like they didn't have the energy to give this child what he needed, so he was moved. So now they're reunited in his brother's foster home. He's there for 4 months. This family decides they can adopt the brother, but not him. Yeah. And so he's placed somewhere else for a month. Why couldn't they adopt him? It's a great question. Because he had been misdiagnosed with RAD. And the foster mom assigned malicious intent to every mistake he made. And she, unfortunately, got on the RAD bandwagon and implemented a lot of parenting techniques that are often recommended for using with kids with RAD. But those techniques are punitive, and they create more distance than they do connection. One of the main reasons we have you guys do this handout and quiz in your pre-certification training is because it's very easy for therapists to diagnose kids with RAD, and it's easy for foster families to not really know any better, But there's so many symptoms of other things that can look like that. Just PTSD, adjustment disorder, ADHD, a lot of things can look like RAD.
All of them have adjustment disorder practically from their adjustment.
Yeah. So in this case, she had found a piece of paper that one therapist who saw him one time for 10 minutes, and she wrote on that piece of paper his diagnosis was reactive attachment disorder. So she Googled it, and just assigned all of that to him. And so whenever he would wet the bed, she would say he's choosing to wet the bed. And she would, if he wasn't bonding to her, she would say, he's pushing her away because he doesn't have the capacity to bond. And so she got on a really toxic bandwagon and was convinced, in spite of our heartfelt efforts to steer her away from that kind of thinking. She was just convinced, and she decided she couldn't handle it. But that's something we'll get to in a little bit, that regression can be a symptom of grief and loss. So, at this age, he's 6 or 7, and he's been potty trained, and now he's wetting the bed at night. And that's a classic, manifestation of grief and loss. It's regression. And we also know about bedwetting that it can be triggered by emotional stress. It can also be genetic. It tends to run in families. And then there could also be a medical reason for it. So, to assign malicious intent, to a young child who's had this many losses already was really, unfortunate, and beyond our ability to, convince her otherwise. So she went on to adopt the brother. He continued to bounce around, went to another home for a month, went to a home in June of 2009 until February of 2010. They were an adoptive placement, but then they went through a divorce. You know, and DHS is really sympathetic to that. I mean, they get, you know, life happens. We've had a couple of situations where, you know, foster moms have just up and left, you know, filed for divorce and left dad there with the kids. And DHS has been surprisingly supportive of trying to help make it work for a single parent who might find themselves unexpectedly in that situation. But in this case, you know, they went through a divorce and it was messy, and you know, they wanted the kid out. So then he was in another home for about 11 months, in August of 2010 to the end of July 2011. This was just, you know, a potentially adoptive home, but it was because there was nowhere else for him. He ended up in, you know, his 10th foster home in July of 2011, stayed there to November of 2011. Now this is a critical junction here, and it is also you know, a testimony to the community at Hope and Home. So he's in this foster home for 4 months, and it's an older couple, and they had been doing foster care for a while, but they were friends with another couple at Hope and Home, other foster parents. And so this other couple did respite for the older couple. They got to know this child, and like immediately decided they had to have him. He had to be part of their family. And so his next move was into his forever family. But that was 11 homes before he was finally adopted. So there's two things that I want to point out. One, the community at Hope and Home is very intentional. The support groups, the Facebook page, all of the events that we do. It gives, you know, all of our families and kids a chance to interact and get to know one another. And there will be kids along the way who may not be able to stay in one foster home, but maybe you've done respite for them in the past, or maybe you've, you know, met them at an event and you're like, oh yeah, I know him. And sometimes that's how kids find their forever homes, through our community, very, very organically. And that is what happened with this child. It was the community that exposed him to his adoptive family. So he was finally adopted, and what's beautiful about this is adoptions, for the record, do not happen quickly. Okay, they can drag on. In this case, because he had been in foster care for so long and he had had so many homes, the judge expedited his adoption. So he was placed in this home November 14th, and he was adopted just a month later, 2 days after Christmas. Yeah, and that it's never happened since. That's the only time we've ever seen an adoption happen that rapidly.
Very good judge.
Yeah. You know, so the two things, the community, yeah.
So, do you have an average of how many placements kids normally end up with?
Average of how many placements kids normally end up with? It's hard to say. We have some kids who land and they stay there until they go home. They stay there until they're adopted.
Yeah, I don't know that there is an average, and what tends to happen is
kind of an anomaly that would be this.
No, no,
unfortunately. I would, unfortunately, no. We've
that's
had
not-
kids who have had 17 placements, teens who have been in 20 foster homes because they've just drifted in the system. Yeah. We try to minimize those moves, and put all of our effort and energy into stabilizing placements and giving families breaks and supporting them. But like I said, some kids land in the middle of the night, and it's not until a month later you're like, this doesn't work, for whatever reason. But we try to avoid those disruptions, with all of our strengths.
So we will have a rec. You will tell us like how many homes this kid will be ready before we come to us or something like that, or won't.
Are you saying, would we tell you how many homes he's been in before? Yeah.
Depends.
Yeah.
We can talk more about this later, but it all depends on whether it's an emergency placement or not. If it's an emergency placement, we don't know anything. We get a phone call in the middle of the night and they're removing 2 kids. We hope that they have the genders right. They don't always. We sometimes have, we thought we had 3 boys and we had 2 boys and a girl. And so it's the other way around. We thought we had 2 boys and a girl and they're all boys. So in emergency placements, we know virtually nothing. In this case, he'd been with us for so long that we knew each of these was a planned placement, so we knew exactly how many he'd been through.
And what's also remarkable, again, it's not an anomaly. Like I said, we have kids who have, unfortunately, been through a lot more homes before they even come to Hope and Home. But what's remarkable about this child is he did great. He did well in school. All he wanted to do was please his foster parents. He didn't act out. He wasn't violent. He was an easy child. And that's, to me, what's really remarkable about him having to move as much as he did. It was, things that were out of our control and things that were out of his control. But he ended up with a phenomenal family with a lot of siblings. He's 15 now, and he's on a football team, and, big family.
Does he see his brother, or do you know?
Do we what?
His brother who got adopted.
Oh, his brother. I don't think they stay in touch. But his brother. I think he's still in the Springs, and I think he's doing okay. I check up on him on Facebook occasionally. Yeah. His brother's all right.
He's on Nathaniel's in Texas, right?
Right. Yeah. So he's in Texas. Jason, this child, is in Texas at the moment. But I heard they're going to be moving back to Colorado soon. But he's doing very well. So, again, 2 things. The community at Hope and Home is very intentional, and just the magnitude of losses that a child can experience at such a young age. His mom's rights were terminated. He was close to adoption in several situations. Just those losses are profound. And when he was with his with his brother's foster mom, if you can even call them behaviors, what he was displaying there, was him being in the throes of grief and loss, of losing his adoptive home and saying goodbye to the lady he thought was going to be his mom forever.
Yeah, it's a long time, almost 2 years.
Yeah.
Are there any medical people in the room?
I'm trained as a nurse and I'm almost a therapist.
Okay, well you're gonna.
That's why I was like, that doesn't fit right at all.
So here's the question. Have you heard the phrase, don't go looking for a zebra when you have a horse right in front of you? You know what that means? Does anyone know what that means? It means if you're a doctor and someone presents with a cold And don't go looking for something exotic. It's probably a cold. If you have a horse in front of you, don't go looking for a zebra. Zebras are very rare. And so if something obvious is right in front of you, why would you search for something exotic? And that's what that phrase means in the medical community. Or when you hear the sound of hooves, don't go looking for a zebra, go looking for a horse. And so that helps you think about diagnosis. When a child like this has any behaviors at all, don't go looking for something exotic. It's obvious where it came from. How would any one of us feel having 11 placements between the ages of 4 and 7? I mean, that's your answer. And so we get frustrated sometimes at Hope and Home when people go looking for exotic answers and seek sometimes exotic medicine or weird kinds of things to treat kids with, when it's right here. It's right in front of you. This is what it is. That can go away, and in many ways he's going to grow up and be a great kid and have, like you said, have a normal life. But when he was having any kind of troubles at all, you have the answer. Don't look for something exotic. This is your answer. And so the question is then, how do you treat this?
Yeah, and the article, the thick insert in there, discusses that. They call it the allure of rare diagnoses. And, they believe that's part of the phenomenon, part of what's going on with why this is misdiagnosed and overdiagnosed. Any thoughts or questions so far?
We need 2 questions.
What's your favorite color?
Oh, we're back to that one. Buddy the Elf, what's your favorite color? 2 good questions. We know you have them. So, yeah.
The question. We just got placed 2 weeks ago, and it's a tragic situation, obviously. So every time she's visiting her birth mom, she'll come back. So she came with just the clothes on her back at like 9:30 at night. And since then, we've had birth parent meetups, and every time she comes home, Mom sends her home with a blanket or an animal, or does things that are really triggering to her, obviously. And so it's hard for me to know, because it's a reminder, it's a constant thing. But so my protective heart is to say, I just maybe put it away and we just forget about it until another time. But this is a reminder of Mom, and this is what Mom gave her. And so I think that's my hardest thing lately, is every time we have these meetings, she comes home with these things, and I just don't know what's the best thing for her, because every time she'll see it, she'll just cry, or,
How old is she?
She's 2. She just turned 2. So it's in those situations, like, what is the best thing in the midst of grief and loss and comfortability and transition, but it's triggering all these emotions or these behaviors. What should I be doing?
How often are her visits?
They're twice a week for 2 hours at a time.
And how long has she been with you? Just 2 weeks?
Just 2 weeks.
Yeah. And what were the circumstances? Why was she brought into care?
From what we understand, it was an emergency placement, but Mom's a meth addict, and but she came just bruised up.
Yeah.
Had to tell from abuse.
Yeah. Does she have any siblings? Okay. Yeah. So she sees Mom twice a week, and she's just, you're left picking up the pieces. Yeah. And that's also extremely common with kids in foster care. Visits will often trigger a lot of grief and loss and confusion and anger about why they're in foster care. For a 2-year-old, she doesn't have any idea why. A lot of kids can reason a little bit and say, if my mom just does this, if she just gets a house, then I can go home. And they can ride on that, for a while, just to be able to cope with being in foster care. But for a 2-year-old, she's just, removed, and all of a sudden, in a strange home with strange people. What and I don't know if you are there during the visits or if they're supervised. Does the visitation supervisor ever tell you anything about how the visits go?
I mean, we've had, in these 2 weeks, we've had 4 different visits. And of the 4, we've had 3 different supervisors, like, supervise her visitation.
Yeah.
One of them, the very first one, that was her initial, that brought her to our house, was amazing, and she'd tell me as much as she could.
Yeah.
But these other 2, you know, how was it, or anything?
Yeah.
You know, and it was fine, it was good, and she'll just hand it to me and like, oh,
Yeah, yeah.
But it's good. I know, like, we've been in training, I know that, but it's just with these specific items that are triggering her constantly, what are you doing with that?
Can you give me a little bit more specific example, like what kind of item and how does it trigger her?
Yeah, so the very first, so she was placed with us on a Wednesday, so it was her very next day she had a visitation, and she came home with a brand new blanket, like a frozen blanket. So Mom had bought this blanket at the store. So then, of course, you know, I washed it, and you know, and she helped me wash it. But then anytime she'd see the blanket, like, laying around the house, I mean, it was just a weeping fest. And then eventually, about 24 hours later, it was fine. Well, then 48 hours later, there's another visit. Here's a Mickey Mouse. And so it's just every time these items are seen around the house in any way, it's just...
Yeah. Does she have decent verbal skills? Or
for a 2-year-old,
you know, one thing I might recommend in that situation is using that blanket or that Mickey Mouse as a transitional object. So instead of it being a trigger for her, it can be a source of comfort for her. So, you know, she sees the blanket and she falls apart, you know, maybe help her articulate her feelings, because she can't really, you know, she might be somewhat verbal, but she can't really articulate her feelings. She can't really say, every time I see that blanket, it reminds me of Mom and just makes me so sad, you know. But you can articulate that to her, and you can, what's her name? Kiera. You can say, oh, Kiera, this blanket reminds you of Mommy, and that makes you so sad. I know that makes you so sad. Here, let's wrap you up in this blanket, and you can know how much your Mommy loves you, you know, and try to use that as a source of comfort, you know, rather than a trigger. And if she knows that you get, you know, why she's losing it, that she's really experiencing grief and loss, you're articulating, you're validating her feelings. She may be willing to just let you hold her, you know, wrapped in the blanket, and you know, reassure her, I know you miss your Mommy, you know, your Mommy loves you, and you know, you can wrap up in this blanket she gave you, and you know, it can be all better.
Yeah.
I would try that. Sometimes visitation supervisors will say parents aren't allowed to bring gifts. I don't know enough about the situation, you know, to know much.
I think that's really, really good advice. You turn the transitional object, instead of being something that's a trigger, have it around more. It will extinguish over time. The seeing it for the first time and being jolted, if it's around a lot more, it becomes more of a transitional object and more of a nurturance object. Here's the key to that whole thing.
Maybe even call it like her Mommy blanket, or...
And I am doing all those things that you're saying, but to your point, I guess, yeah, the blanket isn't a trigger anymore, and the Mickey Mouse isn't a trigger. So you're right, like it is. It
will extinguish over time, yeah.
But it's just like every 2 days there's a new trigger in the house.
So here's the key to this whole thing. Who is she visiting?
Just Mom.
But from Mom's perspective, she's visiting you.
Yeah, of course.
And so you're the visitor, and she's trying to give her transition objects to help make her visit with you better. And so one of the hardest parts about being a foster parent is, you know, who is the visitor and who is the mom? because as time goes by, if this child stays in your home more, it'll shift. You know, and then what starts happening is the child, oftentimes young children, will call any authority figure mom. And then this mom issues start happening about, you know, if she's calling you mom and she's calling her mom. So these are the traps and challenges of foster care. You know, one of the hardest things of all is navigating this, because there is no answer. There's no simple solution to a child experience. I mean, you're making a great example of what Jackie's been talking about. This child is experiencing grief and loss from her mommy. And the transitional objects help on some level, but make things, I don't know about you guys, I have transitional objects in my life, things that remind me of my mom and dad who have passed away, and it's not always a great memory. I mean, the memory is great, but it sometimes makes me kind of melancholy to see the things that connect me to my past. Same thing.
And I mean, I think what's encouraging is it sounds like she is attached to her mom, which is good. And it sounds like her mom, you know, has the frame of mind to want to comfort her whenever she's not with her. Those are very good. Those are very encouraging, because sometimes, I mean, you have parents who have just not given their kids any attention whatsoever. You know, they don't have any verbal skills because they haven't been talked to. And so, I mean, just the fact that mom is, you know, giving her those things, and she's demonstrating, you know, that not being with mom makes her sad. It's encouraging, you know, that she has experienced some degree of attachment with her mom, you know, and it's good that, you know, if she does end up being with you forever, or longer, she'll bond with you too. How do you feel like the bonding process is going?
Amazing.
Good. Yeah. Because she's had practice. Because she's bonded with her mom. Yeah.
How is your relationship with BioMom?
We have tried to do an icebreaker twice, and both times it's been canceled. So we're trying again for Tuesday. So we have not had any contact at this point.
You haven't met? Okay. One of the things that might be helpful is if you consider what would be a good transitional object for mom. And for example, come to the visit and bring pictures. You know, and say, I want you to have these. These are pictures of, you know. And during your icebreaker, it's really important that you convey to mom that you're 100% behind her and you had nothing to do with the child being placed with you. We don't take kids away. You don't have to say that, but if it comes up, you can say that and say, my job is just to support you and get your baby back to you as soon as possible. So I really want to help you, and I want to do anything I can to support you and take care of your child while your child's with me. And you know, I brought some pictures. If that's okay, you can ask the visitation worker, because I want you to see that, you know, this is the room that she's, because think about from her perspective, she doesn't know anything, and so how helpful would it be to say, this is the room she's sleeping in, this is the crib, look at the blanket, that's the frozen blanket that you gave. I mean, the making a connection with the biomom is really important on multiple levels. But imagine how that would be as a mom to say, for someone to care enough to bring you pictures of what they're doing and what the house looks like. That really helps.
Even jotting down cute things she says or smart things she says, you know, so, you know, you can say to her mom, she is so smart. I mean, here's just a few things she said, you know, in the last few days that I just thought were really cute that I thought you would like.
And one thing that can help with that, one of the reasons that's really helpful, there's many things that are good about that, but if the mom feels like she's aligned and you're her partner, then she can say goodbye to the child in a way that is positive. Now you go play with, you know, mama, you know, you, and you know, and be really good, and you know, you have a good time, and I know she's taking good care of you, and I'll see you again soon. And as opposed to sometimes it's this tear them apart, screaming and yelling, and that's a terrible way when the visitation worker literally has to pry the child out of the parent's arms, and the parent gives the message that she's in distress. If mom's in distress, that transition back to you is going to be stressful. Versus if mom can be really positive and literally do the handoff with you in person, makes a big difference.
Yeah, and what loyalty conflicts are also very real, and they're also a real part of grief and loss for children in foster care.
Before you go into that, I think we had a question in the back.
Oh, sorry.
I just have a question kind of like about that whole situation. For the bio parents to have a visitation, do they have to pass a drug test?
Nope.
Okay, and if they've like showed signs of abuse, and she said she's still bruises, they're still allowed to have visits?
But not if they're, if they are not safe during the visit, they'll cut it short. If they don't have to pass a drug test, but if they show up and the visitation supervisor suspects they're under the influence or intoxicated, the visitation supervisor has discretion to end the visit, but he doesn't have to. If the parent's functional, they can go ahead with the visit, but it's at the supervisor's discretion.
It falls under the same category as drunk church. You know what I mean by drunk church?
No, not at all. No idea.
These unique terms.
No idea what that means.
Is it okay to let people into church who are drunk? It's an interesting question. If they're disruptive, no. If they're dangerous, no. But if someone's arriving at a church and they've got drug or alcohol issues or any other kind of issues, do we close the door or do we say, I'm glad you came here? And so it's the same principle. If they're dangerous, if they're not safe, if there's some negative things that are real significant, then you end the visit. But most of the time, you try and bring them in.
Yeah, and a lot of times
How what?
How do you determine, or how is it determined how frequently the visits are? One time a week versus twice a week?
the younger the child, the more frequently the visits. So infants can have 2 to 3 visits a week because they want that time. You think that's more traumatic, or?
Like in the case you were saying, it almost seems like it's more traumatic for the little girl to be exposed again and again to leaving.
Yeah.
Here's one of the hard things about foster care. I have a good friend who's an attorney. He said it's the only field where you go to school for 3 years, learn how to say the word depends.
Yeah.
The same thing in foster care.
Yeah.
It all depends. And so we've had a case where the judge ordered 5 visits a week, 2 hours a day, because she was breastfeeding. And she wanted to keep that bond. Now, again, it all depends on what was the reason for removal, how significant is the FSP. Every family has an FSP, it's a family service plan. Are there 10 items on the FSP? And is it going to project, are we looking at years before they can get it together? Is there 1 item on the FSP? Is it likely that they're going to go home in a week? And so every case is different. If a child's going to go home very quickly, visits there can be a lot of visits. If the perception is that reunification is probably not going to be the goal, then visits aren't as critical.
But reunification is always the goal.
Most of the time.
Most of the time. It is the goal. The only time it's not is if a parent's, like in prison for 25 years or, they've completely just vanished.
Well, we have some children whose parental rights are terminated. They're teens. They have been through multiple group homes and foster homes, and there's nobody for them. Mm-hmm. And we know that we're looking for an adoptive family right off the bat. So in that case, there would be no visits, or maybe a few visits with someone who's really not going to be an option. But as Jackie's saying, the younger the child, the more the visits, and the longer the visits. And again, they're going to look at the FSP and some of the other practical issues about whether they can have those visits. But the best practices is to have as many visits as possible. And here's something that is important to know, that that trumps the discomfort that people have. And so don't even go there. I guarantee you, don't even go there with an attorney, with your GAL or your CASA or your caseworker or home supervisor, and try and limit visits based on the fact that the child cries or is just uncomfortable or is triggered by the visits, because the visits really are a right that the bio family has, and I've seen cases where the child screams bloody murder from the moment the bio mom takes the child to the moment they hand the child back, and that was not grounds to stop the visits, because the visits really are the family has a right to reasonable efforts.
I mean, even like infants with asthma, parents will show up and they'll just smell of smoke. That doesn't even,
Right.
cause visits to end. And there's a legal reason for that.
The legal reason is that under the law, foster parents have a right, birth parents have a right to get their act together and get their child back. And if the government doesn't make reasonable efforts to make that right happen, then the government is liable. And so if the government doesn't make reasonable efforts, and visits are a reasonable effort, then the government literally can be in a lot of trouble. And the respondent attorney, the attorney for the parent, the bio parent, can, if she says, I believe there was no reasonable efforts, and the judge agrees, the county is fined substantially for that case. And if there's multiple cases of not reasonable efforts, then that puts in jeopardy any termination. And so if you're headed towards termination and they're going to terminate the rights of this parent, and you're wondering why are the visits still going on, because it's the right of the bio family to try all the way up to the end. And if you revoke that right to try, then the respondent attorney can say, Your Honor, my client did not get her fair share of attempts to get back with her child, and that can invalidate the termination hearing, and it can be grounds for appeal, which will be a year down the road, and the case will be overturned. So you cannot go into termination with any sort of lack of reasonable efforts. And so, again, this is something that bothers foster parents when they're saying, for example, one that's really tough is when you have 3 visits a week and the bio mom never shows up.
Yeah, that was
and you still have to go. And there's some modifications that can happen, like they can say, they have to get there first and call you or something like that. But they're going to continue to schedule those visits, because when it comes time for trial, you have to show that reasonable efforts are made. And look, Your Honor, we had all of these visits set up, and they went to none of them. And then they can't appeal that they didn't have their rights. So it's a really tough thing sometimes when you're in the middle of this and you're wondering, why do we keep doing visits, or why do I have to keep showing up when the bio mom doesn't show up? And it's for that reason. Yeah.
How many times, do they do the visits before, say they're not showing up, and it's just a consistent? How many times do they keep doing that before they cut that off?
It's about 3 to 4 before they'll get the judge to order a call ahead. Mm-hmm. So the parent has to call an hour ahead and say, I will definitely be there. And then if the parent doesn't call ahead, the visitation center contacts you and says, Mom didn't call, so there's no visit today.
However, you will do that dance until the day of termination.
Oh, where you're waiting and seeing call?
And it's awful, because if you have a child that's, say, 10 years old, they're preparing for their visit. Yeah. And they're getting ready and they're getting dressed, and then the phone call comes and they don't get their visit. And then they act out in your house, for the next day and a half, because they're upset, they're depressed, they're angry, don't want to eat dinner, want to be alone or whatever.
it can manifest lack of motivation, to do homework or, pick up their room. And, sometimes it might need to be treated medically. Sometimes just being a sensitive foster parent and being attuned to that child and just giving that child, time and space, to be alone or grieve. There's an excellent book that I want to recommend. You can also get ongoing training for reading this book. It's called Helping Children Cope with Separation and Loss. It's by Claudia Jacque. Helping Children Cope with Separation and Loss. She gives a lot of very good practical tips, for helping kids, go through the grieving process. Sometimes, she says, creating a memory book or putting pictures up or having a special box of memories or things that their parent has given them can help. And she addresses loss in the context of death, but also loss in the context of adoption and child welfare. So that's an excellent book. And then acceptance is a really, it's a real hard thing, and it takes a lot of time, for anybody to get there. Acceptance doesn't mean that they, are happy about it. Acceptance doesn't mean that they're never going to think about the person again. It just means that they have figured out how to live and function with this loss. So many of our kids, even children who are adopted as babies, will express a longing to find their birth parent. Children who have been in foster care who are now 18, 19, 20 years old, they have a longing to find and connect with their biological parents. And so they can accept, what's happened. They can accept that they were separated from their parents, accept that they were adopted, but there's still a longing to know where they came from and to just ask questions and just, learn more about themselves by meeting or reconnecting with their biological parents. We had a different teen girl a few years ago who also self-reported the abuse in her home. She had 3 younger siblings, but they were all teens. They were like 13 or 14, all the way to 16. I think she was 16 when she came into care. So they were close in age, and they were all being abused. And she had self-reported several times before she was finally placed in care. She talks about whenever DHS finally removed them, they were all riding around in the caseworker's car, and the caseworker was on the phone, and they can hear her end of the conversation. And the caseworker was saying, well, if you have one family that can take the 2 oldest, I think we can separate them and put the 2 youngest ones with this family. And so they're hearing this, and it's already such an ordeal that they've been removed, but now it's like terrifying that they may be separated because they really leaned on each other, to survive. And Hope and Home had a family that could take all 4. And whenever she got to that home, she had never met this foster mom before, but she just gave her a hug and she said, "Thank you so much for keeping us together." And that just, sibling bond can be so powerful, and there's always a need for families who can take sibling groups, because, you know, even if they're removed from their home and they self-reported and they want to be, you know, in foster, nobody wants to be in foster care, but they want to be safe and they want to get away from abuse or whatever. Just being separated from the siblings can be like a whole other loss, even if the siblings are just across town and they get to visit them. I mean, being separated from their siblings is a massive loss for kids. And so it was a very powerful moment for the foster mom whenever she just walked in and she broke down and just hugged her and said, "Thank you for keeping us together." And she told the story of hearing the casework talk about sending 3 over here and the boy over here. I mean, it was terrifying for her. So this girl, she loved her foster parents, and this was a set of parents who had never had children of their own, so they went from 0 to 14s overnight, and they just, I mean, it was just like a gift. They just had a gift with teens, and they did end up going to adopt them. So the kids were all doing very well, but this young lady, when she turned 18, she reconnected with her bio mom who was in town, and lived with her bio mom for, you know, a few months, and then, you know, she learned for herself that her bio mom was just a flake and could not be counted on and was just messed up. She had to learn that for herself. You don't want to be the person talking poorly about their birth parent, because so many times in their minds, like with this mom, she wasn't protective, but she wasn't the abusive one, you know, and so this girl had maybe a false hope, and that's part of grief and loss, is like fantasizing about how it could have been or how it could still be, longing and pining. But she had to learn for herself that her mom was not a healthy person, you know, to be around. So she came back home, and then she decided, because it was her stepdad who was the perpetrator of the abuse, then she came back to her adoptive family and decided she wanted to go out to California to meet her biological dad. And he, you know, they hadn't been in touch, you know, for years, and she had this drive to go live with him in California, and they connected and worked out the details, and the foster dad remembers being on the phone with her biological dad, and the biological dad was just like, you know, I always took good care of them. I always did. And he's going, then why are they in foster care, you know? So she went out, and she just had grand hopes, you know, that she was gonna, you know, connect with her family and you know, put down roots in California. And again, she learned after about 6 or 7 weeks out there that her dad was just toxic, and she ended up, you know, coming back home to her adoptive family. But my point in saying, you know, kids may eventually get to a point of acceptance where they can function with the loss, it doesn't mean that they've put it all behind them. It doesn't mean they don't think about it. It doesn't mean that they don't still have fantasies and longings and wonderings of what could have been or what might have been. They may you know, dream about their biological parents and not you know, not want to accept the reality, you know, that their biological parents are really not healthy people to be around. So just keep this in mind. I didn't want to spend too much time on it because I want to move now to some of the things that, you know, we see kids and families encounter a lot. You know, when kids are coping with the enormous loss of being placed in foster care. I mentioned earlier loyalty conflicts. Even for abusive parents, even for neglectful parents, children tend to have an innate loyalty to their biological parents. And they feel, and it's not something they articulate or that may be conscious, but they feel that if they bond with you, or if they have a good time with you, or if they celebrate Christmas with you, that they are betraying their biological family. They feel that loyalty conflict. Like, if I'm bonded to this family, maybe I'm never going to go back to my mom. Or if I'm bonded to this family, that would really hurt my mom's feelings. And so sometimes kids will push their foster parents away as an act of loyalty to their biological parents. And that's also, sometimes part of the bargaining. If I don't connect with this family at all, I'll go home. So loyalty conflicts are very real. And when Ross was talking about the visitation and forming a bond with mom, it really is critical because kids can pick up on whether or not you and mom are on the same page. Kids can pick up on your disdain for their birth parent. And if you are, even if you don't express it, kids pick up on it. If you have disdain or disgust for their bio parents, to them that's a rejection of who they are, because they came from their bio parents, and so they can almost project your disdain for the bio parents to disdain for them. So whenever you have that icebreaker, I'm a huge fan of icebreakers. There are exceptional situations whenever a caseworker will say, Dad's too volatile to have an icebreaker, but I've done a lot of icebreakers in situations like that where they waited forever to have the icebreaker because it was too volatile, and it's always gone very, very well. So even in some situations where it's volatile, if you have someone who knows what they're doing, they can really pull off an icebreaker. But forming that bond with the bio parent also helps alleviate the loyalty conflicts that kids will have when they're coming into care. And you can, again, like Ross said, you can articulate that to the bio mom, and you can say, I'm just here, to support you and just, take care of her while you're, working your plan, and I'm pulling for you. And sometimes that does require putting on your poker face. Sometimes it does require putting on your poker face, but you'll find that even if you don't feel as sincere going into it, you'll find that just connecting with that parent can transform your own feelings. So the icebreakers are huge, and forming a bond with the bio mom is great. I don't remember if Ross mentioned this before, but sometimes kids will be reunified with their families, and maybe the parents couldn't kick the habit, or they fell off the wagon. Kids have to come back into care. If you have a bond with that bio parent, we've seen it many times where the bio parent will say to DHS, I want them to go with this family. And so, that carries a lot of weight with caseworkers and DHS. So if you have that bond, even down the road a year later, that mom will often remember that. And if they do come back into care, they'll say, I want them with this family. So loyalty conflicts, don't take them personally. You can also lean into it rather than try to resist it. And by that, I mean you can say to a child, if you're picking up on some loyalty conflicts, I know I'm not your real mom. You know, I'm not trying to be your real mom. You know, I'm just here to, you know, take care of you while she's, you know, working on her plan, and I'm pulling for her. And I know it sucks, and it's just so hard to be in foster care and not be able to see her whenever you want. You know, but I just want you to know, I'm not trying to replace your mom. You know, you have a mom already, and I know she loves you. You know, so there's no pressure, you know, for you to call me mom or whatever. So you can lean into that loyalty conflict and validate it, and that can kind of ease some of the loyalty conflicts.
Jacque, I just want to add to what you said a minute ago. You heard her say that the bio family can actually ask for you if things don't go well. The opposite is also true. They can ask that you not be the foster family they go to.
That's a good point.
And they will 100% follow that. That's, again, a right that the bio family has. That is that they have a right to a clean slate with each removal.
Wow.
And each removal starts the clock over again. And so if the child was with you for 3 years, goes back to the bio mom, and you had a really bad ending, she can say when the child goes back into care, I'm fine with this, but not the family I had before, because they ... I don't have a good relationship.
My kids hated it there.
My kids hated it, or just I don't have a good relationship with them. And again, the reasonable efforts are required by the county, and if they request not to have the same foster parent, that's always honored. So it's just good to know that when you're in that, if you're reunifying a child and you're just feeling awful about it, Jackie's absolutely right. Your poker face needs to go on. Do everything you can to be supportive of the bio family and the child going home. Tell the child that you really want them to be doing well. Wish everybody well. And we have seen large numbers of kids come back, and as long as they didn't burn that bridge, they go back to the foster parent.
We've also seen bio parents tap into the resource of foster parents, meaning foster parents can become extended family sometimes for these kids. And so, yeah, the kids may go home, but maybe they get to come to your house, you know, every so often for a weekend or a night or a sleepover. Maybe bio mom will call you, you know, to see if you can watch the kids. And we've had a lot of foster parents also going to that role. And it's never an obligation. It's never anything that you have to do if you're not comfortable with it. But when you do have a bond with the biological parent, it can be good to stay in touch with the kids and also see how they're doing. Because even though you're connected with bio mom, you're pulling for her, if you're seeing the kids every so often, you might come across something that you have to report. So it's just good to have, you know, eyes on the kids and keep in touch when it's possible.
One of the things to keep in mind, I'm going to add to this a little bit, is that with the Department of Human Services, they work with any large government agency. I mean, keep in mind the treatment team will have 3 or 4 lawyers on it, and then you have a judge. Nothing with 3 or 4 lawyers moves very quickly, right? And so a treatment planning session, it's very difficult sometimes for things to move forward, but any member of that team can veto a decision. Okay? And so what I'm saying is, when you think about returning a child home, especially when you're really heartbroken by it, it's not just the foster family or the bio family that you want to make sure you don't burn a bridge with. There's a caseworker, there's a CASA, there's attorneys, multiple attorneys, there's the child's GAL. Any one of those, if the end of your case leaves a bad taste in their mouth, they can veto the child coming back to your home down the road.
Or even using you for another child who needs a home.
Yep, that's true.
You know, we've had situations where caseworkers or GALs or DHS has said, we're not going to work with that family. They're too difficult to work with. They're not cooperative.
Yeah, there's a theory that there's a secret no-fly list over the Department of Human Services. I can tell you, as the director of Open Home, it is not It is absolutely not a myth. It is absolutely true. They have a list of families that they don't work with because of, at the end of the case, they decided that family was too difficult. They sabotaged reunification. They were harsh with their worker. They were harsh with the GAL. Somebody complained, and so we know who those families are. We have them here at Open Home. And every once in a while they'll call us for a case, and we'll refer that family. And they go, no. Who else do you have available? And so what we do when if you get on the no-fly list, we try and recoup your reputation by having you do out-of-county cases for a couple of years and rebuild your reputation. Then we go back to DHS and say, I know this family had a hard start with you guys, but look at the cases they've done with another county, and they've done well, so can you take them off the no-fly list?
Well, we really try to prevent you guys from doing that anyway. That's why you have an agency. If you're really, really mad about something the caseworker did or something the GAL did, we don't recommend that you blast an email in the middle of the night to the whole team. That's why we're here. You can send that email to us. You can call us and tell us how upset you are about it. We can contain all of your frustration. We get it. But we try to coach you along the way in working with professionals, which can be a challenge, so that, you have that good rapport and they want to place with you again.
What is a GAL?
Oh, guardian ad litem. That's an attorney for the child.
Keep one thing in mind. If you send us a letter, we have no legal obligation to share it with anyone. Okay, unless you're threatening the president or Homeland Security or something. I mean, there are some obvious examples. If you're threatening somebody or doing something like that, but most of the time, in reality, you send us a letter. We have no obligation to share it with anyone on the team, and we can then meet with you and say, "Do you really want to do this?" And let's talk about that. You send a letter to the caseworker. They have a legal opportunity. They have a legal obligation to share it with the members of the team. They can't keep it from the attorney. They can't keep it from the other attorneys. They can't keep it from anybody. And so we are 100% on your side. If you are upset, vent to us. I just want to also remind you, if you send a letter to, and this happens every once in a while, someone gets really fired up and they type this big long letter and hit that group send or reply all button. Once you do that, we can't rein it back in. Send it to us first. And keep in mind, anything you send to your caseworker, you're writing a letter to the government. Okay? Just think about that.
Or to the court.
Anything that you send to those guys, you're writing a letter to the government. And it doesn't go away, just like you're writing a letter to the IRS. I mean, if you're upset about your taxes, think twice before you write a letter to the IRS. We had a real story of a real family that wrote a letter to the caseworker. It was 7 pages, single-spaced. And she thought that she was telling the government some things they didn't know about how messed up foster care was. The very next day, we get a phone call saying you have a foster parent that we don't think should be a foster parent right now. She's not stable. Because she wrote a 7-page letter in the middle of the night, single space. So their observation is this woman's not stable, and that wasn't what her intent was. Her intent was to tell them that you guys are all messed up. Do you think this is the first time the government's heard that?
Yeah. Nobody's going to change the system, and I think again we're getting a little off topic. We're talking about. I know, but one thing that's just worth adding is. We've got to stay in our lane. Hope and Home is a foster care agency. We're not a lobbying agency. We're not associated with anything political. We're not, trying to tell the government everything they're doing wrong. We do foster care, and that's what you do. You provide foster care, and you're going to see a lot of things that are broken in the system. But share those frustrations with us. And DHS, especially El Paso County DHS, we have very strong relationships with the leadership at El Paso County DHS, and so even though our lane is foster care, we're in a position to influence change. But let us take on that cause if we need to. We will go to bat for you if we need to, and there's going to be a lot of frustration, but come to us and then let us navigate and help you sort through it. There's just two more things that I want to talk about with grief and loss. We talked about loyalty conflicts, and we're going to talk about anniversaries of losses. We have foster parents who can see a pattern over the years, like a particular time of year. A child just starts falling apart, or becomes really quiet, or starts acting out. And the foster parent may not know exactly what happened. Sometimes it could be the anniversary of whenever that child came into care. Sometimes it could be the anniversary of whenever that child had a goodbye visit with their parents after their parents' rights were terminated. So anniversaries are very real, and it's helpful to be able to step back and start asking questions, about the child's history. If they've been in your home for, a while, you might be able to put some pieces together, and you might not ever know, but around the time, that initial loss comes around again the next year, it can bring up a lot of feelings in kids, and it can trigger a lot of old feelings of grief and loss. We know about that. Sometimes holidays, even for adults, can be hard. If we've recently lost a loved one or gone through a divorce or something, those anniversaries can be hard on all of us. So keep that in mind with kids in your home. And then finally, we talked briefly about this, but a classic manifestation of a child experiencing grief and loss is regression. So potty training's also kind of a classic example. A child who's been potty trained, and who's been dry at night, for 3 years, all of a sudden starts having nighttime accidents. Again, don't assign malicious intent to that. Kids do not choose to wet the bed. Some kids may also regress in areas such as tying their shoes or going to sleep at night. They might want more TLC at night when before they've just been fine. It could be an anniversary, but it could also just be, some regression because there's a big change in their life, or there's a lot of uncertainty in their life. And so, we don't, as humans and people, we just don't have, the energy to deal with everything all the time. We have a limited amount of energy that we can devote to some things. And when kids are navigating big changes, whether they're changing schools or they're moving to a new foster home, that's where their energy is going. And they may not have the energy to do something they had previously mastered. So how we handle regression is just lean into it. If we try to punish or tell them to snap out of it, tell them to act their age, it can help them, not help them, but it can cause them to just be more entrenched in that regression, as opposed to when we lean into it, because regression is the kids going back to a stage where they were more nurtured, where they felt more nurtured. And so regression is a clue to you that his child needs more TLC for whatever reason. If he needs more TLC going to sleep at night, let's just, give it to him, and he'll bounce back. But if we punish him and tell them they need to act their age, or shame them, or label it as attention seeking or manipulative, they can be more entrenched. What they need is extra TLC. And child development, is never just a steady climb. Even under the best of circumstances, kids will, achieve a milestone and then fall back in another area, achieve a milestone, fall back in another area. So even in the best of circumstances, it's not a steady climb. So expect kids in your care to regress and need some help with some previously mastered skills. It's another symptom of grief and loss.
Along those lines, quick question: what does the Christian community typically do when someone in a family dies unexpectedly, or something bad happens with the family? What's our normal response? Bring them food. Right. We create a brigade and we start bringing food, right? Is it because they don't know how to cook? No. Is it because there's not 1,000 restaurants, right outside their door in fast food? No. I mean, the reality is the reason we do this is because we want to give them something. We want to help them. We want to let them know that we care, and we do it by meeting basic needs. And so if I can take over some of your basic needs, that will help you with your stress and anxiety, and it will show you that I care about you. So in the same way, if a child can no longer tie his shoes, let's lean into that and let's tie his shoes for him. It's the same thing as bringing food. We're meeting some of your basic needs. Okay, I did your laundry for you. I made your bed for you. All these are messages that we're saying to them that we care about you, we want to help you, and the children receive it the same way we do when people bring us food. And so think about that next time. I mean, you would never say, well, they know how to cook. Why? They're just being manipulative. They want free food. I'm not going to feed into that. But I've heard that about kids. They're just being manipulative. They know how to tie their shoes. If they're regressing and you're meeting basic needs during that regression, you're showing them that you care about them, and that registers. And so it's an opportunity to be there in that moment. In the same way as if somebody has lost somebody, we meet some of their basic needs. They don't need us to, but it says something. And they're struggling.
Well, I will close with a short story about a 5-year-old girl who was trying to go to sleep in her room one night, and she called out to her mom and said, "Mommy, I'm scared." And her mom yelled back, "It's okay, honey, Jesus is with you." And she said, "But I need somebody with skin on." And so, I mean, whenever we are comforting kids, tying their shoes, changing their sheets, holding them when they're crying, holding their hands, we really are delivering Jesus to them. Jesus doesn't come to them in some mystical, way. He comes to them, through the way we care for them, whenever we laugh with them and cry with them and feed them when they're hungry and put Band-Aids on them when they scrape their knee. So knowing kids in foster care, you'll have a lot of joys. You'll have a lot of wonderful moments, but there's always going to be that sense of loss that every child feels. And so you are tasked with picking up the pieces and with just providing comfort and meeting their basic needs and beyond. C.S. Lewis said, no one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. When kids are grieving, it might feel scary, very scary for them. And another, a foster child, an anonymous foster child said, no one notices your tears, no one notices your sadness, no one notices your pain, but they all notice your mistakes. So be sure to notice children's feelings, notice their sadness, and reach out to them, give them space and compassion and comfort as they grieve. They'll get through it, and you guys will be completely instrumental in helping them. So that's it. Thank you guys for being such a great group. Thank you. Yeah. Turn this off.